This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
I just wanted to start by talking about the stimulus for the talk. The idea came when I was at the Hugh Lane Gallery, which is the art gallery which is just up the road by Parnell Square. And quite recently there was an exhibition of film and photography, and it was all to do with the studio of Piet Mondrian. So Mondrian is a Dutch artist. He's probably one of the more famous artists of the 20th century, where he's famous for paintings of squares, rectangles, and lines of different colours. He had a particularly famous studio in Paris that he worked in the 20s and 30s, where he developed some of his most characteristic ideas and paintings. A Dutch architect basically took it upon himself to recreate the studio. The studio was demolished in the late 1930s. There was a number of photographs of the studio, and this man called Frans Postma, if that's how you pronounce his name, who is an architect, took it upon himself to recreate the studio. So it was such a sort of revered space of 20th century art that he took it upon himself to recreate it. And what was interesting is they didn't have the plans of the building, and they had photographs only. So they had black and white photographs of this space, and they recreated the studio from the photos. Now, apparently later on, they actually found a floor plan, and it's a bit of a mysterious space because it's a 5-sided room. So they couldn't figure out how it all fitted together from the photographs, and people who visited were confused about the way that it was constructed. So it was a sort of mystery, and then they finally figured out that part of the reason it was so difficult to recreate was because it was a pentagon, which is kind of slightly ironic considering that Mondrian's paintings are always squares. I don't think we did any pentagons at all. But anyway, that's what was being kind of celebrated in this exhibition. And more than that, so it was quite an act of reverence to recreate the studio, which they did, I think, for a big retrospective of his paintings. But then there's an Irish artist who made a film of the recreated studio. It was in the Hugh Lane for quite a number of months. A very, very beautiful film. It was an hour long, and it was basically a film of them assembling this. It's kind of a kit set. They kind of made this sort of kit set of the studio, and they filmed, or this man and his crew filmed very, very carefully and meticulously the construction of the studio and then the dismantling of the studio. It's really quite amazing. And one of the things they had in the exhibition, as well as the film, was they had photographs of colours. And you might think that's a strange thing to do, to have a photograph of a square of colour. But what was more interesting was that the photographs were black and white. So they had black and white photographs of colours. I was really taken with this. I went to see a talk by the artist John Beattie, and he talked about making these black and white photographs of different colours and just the level of care and meticulous detail he went into. So what all this amounted to and why it was, what I was really taken by is just the reverence with which the artist was held in by not just the architect, but by the artist who made the film. You'd have to hold the artist in the highest of esteem to be able to actually commit yourself to such an exhaustive project, both of them. So that was one of the, I thought, wasn't that fascinating? So the space where this artist created so many iconic works is so revered that people would do that. And of course, part of the idea, if I can remember rightly, for the exhibition was to have it in the same gallery where another studio of another famous 20th century artist is also recreated, or rather I should say reassembled. So most of you probably know them, but Francis Bacon, who's a famous English artist who was born in Dublin, he worked in a place in Kensington in London for about the last 60 years of his life, well, the last 30 years of his life, sorry. And again, many of his, I wouldn't say most, but many of his very, very famous paintings were created in that space. And the whole lot of it was boxed up and reassembled in Dublin, including an incredible amount of detritus is the way that one of the man who was involved with doing it describes it. He couldn't have had a more different aesthetic to Mondrian. So I think that's one of the reasons why it was so fascinating. So Mondrian's studio was incredibly austere. That is sort of aesthetic. There were no curved lines anywhere except he had this kind of coal fire that was a cylinder in the middle of the room, sort of an old 19th century coal fire, which to heat the place. But everything else was straight lines and squares and rectangles. And very, very tidy. Nothing was put there without, you got the impression that the utmost care. Bacon's studio, on the other hand, was a kit. That's what it is. It was, or a tit, as I would say in New Zealand. Hello, New Zealand. It was just strewn with decades of detritus, cans of paint that are dried brushes, bits of cloth that he'd used to apply paint. He used to mix his paint on the walls. So he'd mix, to get a particular colour, he'd mix it and then he'd blob it onto the wall. So someone's actually studied the blobs of paint on the wall and determined which of the paintings relate to which of the blobs of paint on the wall. And apparently the other thing was that he liked to make his own paint. So he had these pigments which he liked. I think there was a particular colour, maybe an orange. And he used to, it was the pigment dust in the room as well. So it's a complete mess. So he talks about how he couldn't make, that chaos suggests images to him. That's the way he pushed it. So that was his space. Now that's not, like I say, that's not a recreation. That's like a reassembly. They literally took the whole thing apart and reassembled it, including the staircase, the floorboards, the windows. So if you haven't seen it, it's really well worth a visit, actually. Even if you're not particularly enamored of Bacon's paintings, because not everybody is, but even if you're not, it's still a fascinating thing to look at. And of course, the fact that they had the Mondrian show in the same gallery as the Bacon show, I think was quite a deliberate thing to have done. But again, what strikes one when you look at it, it's just the incredible reverence to do that. It took them years to do that, apparently, to recreate that studio, and they literally took every single bit of detritus and put it exactly where it was, where he left it when he died. So incredible act of reverence for the art. Both these exhibitions, the film of the recreation and the photographs of colour and so on, and the Bacon exhibition just exhibit an amazing reverence and fascination with these artists' spaces. And this seems to be a kind of a wide phenomenon, that artist studios and artist spaces around the world are highly revered. And there's quite a number of different examples. For example, there's Frida Kahlo's house in Mexico City in Coyoacán, the Casa Azul, which is almost like a shrine to her and Diego Rivera and their art. Rivera, sorry. And of course you get it in other art forms. So I visited the house of Benjamin Britten in East Anglia in England, which is like a kind of, they've left the house. All of his stuff is there. You can go into the studio where he composed a number of his really iconic pieces, including the War Requiem. And there's been books published. So I was reading a book recently called The Artist Studio, A Cultural History by someone called James Hall. And he basically traces the history of artist studios right back to ancient times and conceptions of the Greek gods and the workshops in ancient Greece, right up to the present day. And there's numerous books about the Bacon studio. So the question arises, why should this be? What does studying the creative space offer in addition to studying the work? So you might think, well, why not just study the work? Why why I become so fascinated with the space where the work is created. So what does that add? So I think the first thing probably is, maybe it's obvious, but by doing that, by investigating the space, you may gain some insight into the creative process of the artist. So I'll just read you a little bit. This is a little bit from someone called Brian Clark. You got that name right? Brian Clark, yeah, who became the executor of the Bacon estate, who was himself is quite a well-known British artist. So this is what he says about the room. Going into the room after Bacon had passed away, he was friends with Bacon and had been into the room when he was alive, but he's now going into the space quite a number of years after he'd passed away. At first appearance, it was a frenzy of chaotic and indiscriminate hoarding. It was very dense, the densest room I had known. It was violently intense and belligerent. It sucked the breath from your lungs. It was exhilarating and repulsive. It was Francis Bacon's studio, and I was a trespasser in it. And then he goes on. The sound of paper being torn, brushes dragged over dry canvas, and the blinkered, singular focus of a young man devoid of self-pity trapped in a dying body. It was all there in this miserable little room. Everything I ever wanted to be was here. It was as mystical as the cell of a monastic saint and as human as excrement. This tiny upstairs bedroom of a South Kensington news house had been transformed through decades of organised chaos into the repository of the most ruthlessly edited and individualistic chronicle of our times, a compressed layering of images of man at his worst, his best, his most disarming and most desolate. There was nothing here that was median or banal. Old canvases leaned upon each other against the wall, the walls themselves splattered with paint and thick impasto where colours had been impatiently tested, one over the other for almost 30 years. So you can see this artist trying to kind of just soaking in the atmosphere and sort of in a way reliving all the creative work that had gone on in that studio over a period of 30 years. And, you know, Bacon was famous. I think he worked every day in the morning and then he'd go out and drink, apparently. You have to know with his pals, but he worked every single day, you know, and this, I mean, it's a very small room and it doesn't have any windows, it's a skylight, it's quite something. So by going into those spaces, presumably it's the same with Mondrian's space or somebody else's space, you gain an insight into the creative process. Furthermore, by visiting the studio, one could immerse oneself in the consciousness of the artist. So what do I mean by consciousness? What I mean is a kind of sensibility, a way of perceiving, the way the artist perceives themselves, the other people, the world around them. So it's a kind of an awareness that they have. And, you know, when you enter into that, you can see something of what the artist saw. You see something, you see things in the way that they saw it. And of course, for a while, you can live in that world, at least partially, at least for a while. And of course, the artist might see things more clearly and more truly, at least in certain respects. So there's, for example, there's so many paintings of Bacon's, but one of them, which made a particular impression on me, was there's a very, very famous painting of a screaming Pope. I mean, a lot of his paintings are quite shocking. The kind of vividness and kind of luridness of them, and the kind of almost violence of them. But this one particularly, I found quite arresting. And for me, it was just a very, very powerful expression of repression, of the horror and hell of repression. So really kind of, maybe I was, I don't know, encountering. Well, I mean, Sadai Sivi mentioned that I was the chair of this Buddhist Centre here, and sometimes I did feel the need to kind of hold things in order to, there's a certain pressure if you're running a religious organisation to sort of live up to the ideals that you espouse. And I could see if you didn't, what a hellish experience that might be. And for me, the painting, when I saw that painting, I thought it was a real lesson. I think do not pretend to be something that you're not. That's what it communicated to me. I mean, it maybe Bacon has something quite different in mind, but at least that's what it communicated to me. So it sort of made that more vivid and had quite a strong effect. And of course, through engaging with the space and also through engaging with the work, of course, there's a communication of a particular perspective, so that the artist has a particular way of understanding the world. So according to Buddhism, according to the Buddhist teaching, we all have what's called a view. Dristi is the Sanskrit, or Ditti is the Pali. So we all have a particular perspective on the world, and that includes a sense of our place in the world. So we have a sense of what we're here for. Whether that's conscious or unconscious, we all have it. It's not just a cognitive thing. It's not just thoughts that we have. It's also emotional. It's like an attitude. We have an attitude to our life. And according to the Buddha's teaching, we can't not have this. So if we're, the Buddha apparently didn't have it, but that's another story. But we can't not have this, and we can't not communicate it. So even if we think life isn't worth anything and doesn't have any meaning, that's still a view. That's your view of life, that it has there's no value in it. So you can't help but communicate. So when you see an artist's work, what you're encountering is their particular perspective. And very often artists are revered because there's something about that perspective which has got the quality of newness to it. It's like you see something as if for the first time, you see something that you've never seen before. You see a perspective that's dazzlingly original. There might even be a sense that the artist is producing new values, or at least values which did not exist, or were not experienced or perceived before. So very often, when you get into art theory, I mean, I haven't really looked at it very much, but people have got a very, very strong sense of what life's about and what they're trying to do with their art, which is an expression of that. It's very interesting Bacon's actually quite articulate when he gets going about art. I mean, he had a fairly kind of bleak sense of possibility in terms of human life. I think Mondrian had a more, from what I can gather, I haven't looked into them a lot, but a much more, for want of a better word, sort of spiritual perspective. So that's one of the things I think one experiences when one encounters somebody that you haven't encountered before. Sometimes it can just be really exciting to get to listen to music or to read poetry or fiction or anything really, or look at art from somebody that you've not encountered before. It's sometimes going to be really thrilling to kind of encounter this completely new perspective. So I'll just on this same topic. So I'm basically talking about how we can immerse ourselves in the consciousness of the artist. Brian Clark, this guy who was the executor, who was instrumental in moving the studio to the Hugh Lane. This is what he says. He basically produced a book called Detritus, which is a record of some of the significant objects he found, which give an insight into the kinds of images which stimulated Bacon's painting. So famously, Bacon didn't paint from life. He tended to paint from images. He had thousands of books with all kinds of different things in them, for all kinds of very strange stuff. Things like, he had a book of like people playing cricket, and then you'd have a book of very disturbing skin lesions, and then and all sorts of, and then you'd have books of animals, like wildlife, just an incredible array of different things, and then of course reproductions of works of art, Velasquez, and particularly Velasquez, and etc. Anyway, this is what Brian Clark said about sifting through this detritus. He said, the experience of spending time in Bacon's studio and becoming familiar with the material that inspired him altered me. I have a desire to share that remarkable moment. It can, in the absence of spatial experience, only be in part, that detritus comes very close to replicating what it was like for me, examining this material for the first time after carrying it home from Rees News. So Rees News is this studio. It comes closer than any other means I am able to imagine. So it's wonderful. So he's basically trying to give you some kind of flavor of what it was like to be in that studio, but quite a number of years after he passed away, just kind of trying to understand what all this meant. And he produced this book, which was his way of trying to express what that experience was like, which is interesting in itself, because he wants to communicate that. You know, he feels like he needs to communicate this experience that he's had, which seems to be the impetus for so much art, is that you've had an experience and you feel this compulsion to try and communicate it to somebody else. It seems to be a very fundamental kind of human thing, that it's, you know, at its highest level is expressed in the arts. So yeah, so what he says, the experience of spending time in Bacon's studio and becoming familiar with that material, familiar with the material that inspired him, altered me. That's the key phrase. It altered. He felt altered by it. Something about his consciousness was altered by it. And that's the case whether we're artists. I mean, this guy's an artist, but often you might see something, and even if you're not an artist, you come out feeling like you've been altered by it. You know, in any kind of aesthetic experience, you can have this. You know, like whether it's a play or you know, being in nature, perhaps, or reading a book. Your sensibility is shifted. So yeah, so that's one of the reasons why you might engage with a space. And I think the way Brian Clark writes really epitomizes that process of engaging with the material. And you know, actually, in the case of Bacon, there was a lot to engage with. I think with Mondrian's studio, you'd probably just be going and thinking, wouldn't give you many clues. But I think Bacon left a lot of clues. Partly because he didn't have a chance to tidy up. He died, they had a heart attack when he was away from England. So presumably it was just left. Everything was left in situ. But another thing about these spaces is when you visit a space, well, it reminds you that these people were human beings. I mean, it might sound like an obvious point, but the art object very easily becomes divorced from its source. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things, I suppose, about art, is it's portable. You know, you can move it around. But what happens is things get taken out of context. We think that it's all about content rather than context. So I think particularly these days, we're kind of almost obsessed with content. Like content has become king, but context is almost completely lost. I mean, I don't know if you found this in the whole COVID pandemic thing. I thought everything was content and there was no context. The context was just standing in front of your computer screen. So something is lost in that. And I know we all felt the loss. It's interesting there that one of the spaces that I looked into a little bit was a space by a sculptor called Brancusi. I haven't pronounced his name right, but that's how the Oxford Dictionary says he pronounced his name, Brancusi. Anyway, he was a sculptor based in Paris again, and his whole studio is being recreated. It's just by the Pompidou Centre in Paris. And interestingly, for him, the studio was the work. The context was as important as the work itself. So apparently, when in his latter years, he was very, very concerned with the way things were in the studio. And actually, apparently, when he sold a work, he'd make a replica of it to put in the studio. So everything would remain, the kind of whole aesthetic impression would remain intact. So he's very interesting in that sense, that context was as important as the actual object, and that he insisted that, you know, he gave his studio to the French state and insisted that it was to be kept the way that he left it. So we can, art objects can become sort of dissociated from the people that produce them. And again, I think another thing is through over-familiarization. So often the thrill of the newness of an object is taken away because we're already familiar with it before we've even seen it. You know, some of the most iconic, you know, images of Western art, they've reproduced so much. I mean, people have even made art about this, haven't they? But that you know it before you've seen it. And it's wonderful, I suppose, that we can reproduce things so well. But the danger is that we don't appreciate them anymore because we're flooded with images. So, you know, at these days, you go into the website of any of the great art galleries in the world, or any, not even great ones, but anyone, and look at what's there. You know, you can see whatever you like. You can even get really high quality images for free from these websites. It's amazing. But yeah, part of the effect of that is we forget that these pieces of art or music or whatever come from an actual human individual. Very often I notice this when I hear music in a different context from the context that I'm used to hearing it in. So I remember hearing, some of you might know a piece, it was a piece by John Coltrane, which he recorded in the middle of the 1960s, called A Love Supreme. And I got really into it in my teens. And I went to a concert by a band, some of you might remember, called Living Colour. They're a rock band. Significantly, they're all black musicians, which was unusual at the time, playing rock music. And they had this song called Cult of Personality. So I was in Wellington, the town hall. And before they came on, they played the whole of A Love Supreme over the PA. It was like absolutely mind-blowing, partly because it was such a good sound system, but I just wasn't expecting it. So I was hearing this music as kind of almost as if I'd never heard it before. And it just reminded me of how amazing it was. I'd sort of become so familiar with it. It didn't mean as much to me anymore. And it's a little bit like, I think sometimes it's like that. I've just lamented the overexposure to art. But sometimes if you see a familiar artwork in the flesh, so to speak, for the first time, it can be really quite amazing because it's not quite what you expect. If you really look at it, something comes across. It doesn't come across when you see it on your computer screen or when you see it reproduced in a book. I had a particularly vivid experience. I sort of happened upon, well, it was kind of an unintentional pilgrimage, I suppose you could say. I happened upon Bach's birthplace. So I was visiting family in a place called Eisenach in Germany. And I didn't know, but that's where Bach was born. Also, apparently Martin Luther had a big influence. I'm not sure if he was born there, but he certainly had a big influence on the town. So I just happened across the place where Bach was born. And, you know, like I've been playing and listened to his music since I was small, not playing it very well, but I attempted to play it. But I certainly listened to it. And I just sort of stumbled across this place, and it just was a little plaque that said, this is the house where Johann Sebastian Bach was born in, 1685. And I was really moved. There was a big statue of him as well, but it's just the fact that this is where this person lived and was born. And I was really moved by it. And I didn't realize that he meant so much to me. The point I'm trying to make here is that the person meant something to me. It wasn't just the music. It wasn't just the art. There's something about you actually have an encounter with a person, where even if the person's been dead, in the case of Bach, I mean, he's been dead for what, 250 years or so, something like that, a long time. So there's something about the man or the woman who's made that aesthetic production who it kind of touches you. So I'm reminded of a famous line from Walt Whitman, the poet, the American poet. He says, "Behold, I do not give lectures or a little charity. When I give myself." So there's something going on where you're actually encountering a person through that art. It's not just sensuous impressions that you're receiving. You're actually receiving, as it were, a gift or an offering from an actual person. And I have to say, it really shocked me because I wasn't sort of keyed up to see, this museum of Johann Sebastian Bach. I just sort of chanced across it, and it just really surprised me. And it kind of offends, I suppose, a sort of certain materialism that in me, it's just about the stuff, isn't it, really? But it's not. There's something else going on. So it's as if our understanding of the person is enriched by visiting the place associated with that person, because something about the person's presence is more alive in that space. So it seems strange that this should be so. Like, one might ask, has the person actually changed the place, or is it just the associations that we have with it? I mean, that's a really interesting question. Like, is there something about the place which changes, or is it just our association? Does it matter? But the point is that they're more vividly alive, at least for us, than in that place. So our personal connection with that person is enlivened and enriched by being in that place. So what I'm talking about is about people that are no longer with us. So people, it's no longer possible to be with a person in the flesh, but we can be with them through imagination. And like I say, being in the places where they have been makes them more real somehow. So I remember seeing a talk by Salman Rushdie, the famous writer. And he was writing, I haven't actually read the book, but he was talking about a book that he'd written about a famous city somewhere in the East. Again, I can't remember what the city was called. Some of you might have read the book, I don't know. But he talks about, and he'd done an incredible amount of research into this ancient city and what life was like in the city several hundred years ago, maybe even longer ago than that. And he talks about going to the actual ruins of the city, and he talks about seeing it in his mind's eye, seeing it kind of built through his imagination. It was that vivid to him because he immersed himself in the study of this place so much. He could sort of see it. He could see it in his mind's eye. So I think it's like that. If you visit a place, you can, if you know it, it comes alive and it's more than the imagination. There's something about being in the place. So again, I mentioned pilgrimage, the word pilgrimage. So pilgrimage suggests something religious. So because of what's happened in a place, the place becomes, as it were, sacred. So something spiritual, for want of a better word, or transcendental, for want of a better word, has kind of touched the material realm because of the actions that were performed there, because of the things that happened there. So this is the Buddhist understanding anyway, that it's like the way that what happens, what we do, which changes the space, which is a significant, has an impact on the place. So this is, in a way, now I'm coming to the second part of the title of the talk, which is Sacred Spaces. Talks some while about creative spaces and the different reasons why creative spaces would be, repay study, in addition to the work that is produced there. So I want to say something about sacred spaces, and particularly in the context of Buddhism. One could say a lot about this, obviously, but I just want to say something about in the context of Buddhism. So the Buddha wasn't given to false modesty. There's a famous passage in a text where he meets somebody for one of the very first people he meets after he gains enlightenment. And he says, amongst other things, he says, I am the accomplished one in the world. I am the teacher supreme. I alone am a fully enlightened one whose fires are quenched and extinguished. So from the Buddhist perspective, this wasn't boasting. From the Buddhist perspective, he was just stating something that was a fact. It was simply just stating the way he saw things. And he actually encouraged people to think about him and discuss him and reflect on him. There's actually a practice. It's called Buddhanusati, which means something like recollection of the Buddha. It's a spiritual practice where you simply bring to mind the Buddha's qualities. Now, close to the time he died, the Buddha encouraged people to visit the places that were most significant in his life. So there's this famous passage where Ananda, who is the Buddha's companion, basically asks the Buddha, well, well, I'll tell you what he says. This is what the text says. This is from quite a long text called the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which recounts the last days of the Buddha. It's quite long, actually. It's like a short novella. Anyway. So this is Ananda, the Buddha's companion of 25 years, his cousin. And he calls the Buddha Lord. Sometimes, that's a translation of a Pali term. Formerly Lord, on leaving their quarters after the rains, so this is like the Buddha's followers would stay in the same place during the rainy season because he couldn't move about because the roads turned to mud. On leaving their quarters after the rains, the bhikkhus are monks, followers of the Buddha, would set forth to see the Tathagata. That's another name for the Buddha. And to us, there was the gain and benefit of receiving and associating with those very revered bhikkhus who came to have an audience with the Blessed One and to wait upon him. So it's interesting. It's like it's saying people would go and see the Buddha, and then people would talk to the people who'd gone to see the Buddha. But Lord, after the Blessed One has gone, we shall no longer have that gain and benefit. So it's a bit like we used to come and see you, and we used to see people who used to come to see you, and that was a real benefit. But when you're dead, what we're going to do? That's the basic gist of what he's saying. And this is what the Buddha says. He says, there are 4 places, Ananda, that a faithful person should visit and look upon with feelings of reverence. What are the 4? Here the Tathagata was born. This, Ananda, is a place that a faithful person should visit and look upon with feelings of reverence. So again, the Tathagata is the Buddha. Here the Tathagata became fully enlightened in unsurpassed supreme enlightenment. This, Ananda, is a place that a faithful person should visit and look upon with feelings of reverence. Here the Tathagata set rolling the unexcelled wheel of the Dhamma. This, Ananda, is a place that a faithful person should visit and look upon with feelings of reverence. Here the Tathagata passed away into the state of Nibbana, in which no element of clinging remains. This, Ananda, is a place that a faithful person should visit and look upon with feelings of reverence. These, Ananda, are the 4 places that a faithful person should visit and look upon with feelings of reverence. So it's like these are the 4 holy sites, basically, the 4 most revered pilgrimage sites in Buddhism, where the Buddha was born, where he gained enlightenment, where he first taught the Dhamma, and where he passed away. So, and what the Buddha is encouraging his followers to do is to reflect on what happened there. Here the Tathagata was born. Here the Tathagata became fully enlightened and unsurpassed supreme enlightenment. So again, there's a sense of being in that space. You have a more vivid encounter with the significant actions and events of a person's life. And it really is like that. I've been to 2 of those places, and you really do have a very vivid sense of the significance of what happened there. And you have a much stronger sense of the Buddha. And what's interesting, again, this word reverence comes out. I've used that a couple of times already. This is the place where the new emerged. So values which did not exist or were not experienced or perceived before come into being. And it's interesting, just in regard to this idea of the new, the Buddha talks about when he, in his first teaching of the Dharma, his teaching, he says, thus, bhikkhus, thus monks, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. So things not heard before. So it's like he discovered something new. And the Buddha himself recognized the importance of place. So these places are still visited today. I've been to, like I said, I've been to a couple of them myself. So of course the Buddha, he taught the Dhamma. He was a person. I think this is one of the key things we need to realize. He wasn't a god, a prophet of God, an incarnation of God, or the child of God. He was a human being. The tradition has it that he was more than a human being. We tend to just have these 2 categories, God, human being, but in the Buddhist thought, there's this other category of an enlightened human being. And without going into that in great detail, what that means is a state of freedom, knowledge, and love. And his teaching is similarly addressed to human beings, to us. And he started in the same place that we start from. We can grow in the same way that he did. And his teaching starts with a recognition of dukkha, which means something like unsatisfactoriness. So put negatively, that means that we just feel a profound sense of dis-ease. Things aren't quite right, and we feel it and we know it. And that makes us look for something beyond. Somehow we know that there's more, that we can be more than we presently are. So put positively, we recognize that we're not enlightened. We recognize that it's possible for us to gain a state of freedom. In other words, we feel an affinity with the Buddha. So this is analogous. The reason I'm saying this, it's analogous to the response that we have to an artist or to an aesthetic experience. It speaks to something. There's an affinity within us which is sort of stimulated by that piece of art, whatever it happens to be. So there's a little bit I want to read to you from, it's actually from a play by Alan Bennett, a British writer, and he's talking about reading. It's a play set in a school. There's a schoolmaster talking to a school boy. That's what he says. The best moments in reading are when you come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at things, which you had thought special and particular to you. Now here it is, set down by someone else, a person you have never met, someone even who is long dead, it is as if a hand has come out and taken yours. So I say it's analogous to the Buddha's teaching, because there's a sense of recognition that what the person is saying is something that you feel deeply yourself, and you recognize it as such. So I say it's analogous. I mean, we can't all become a Bach or a Bacon or a Mondrian, but according to the Buddha's teaching, we can all become a Buddha. So there's an important difference. There's an important difference there, and between the world of the arts and the world of the Buddha's teaching, and also a difference between artists on the one hand and the Buddha on the other. So the Buddha is whole. So he's known as the Sammasambuddha, Buddha, the fully and completely enlightened one. The Buddha, in other words, is completely integrated. So there isn't that sense of tension within his being. There's a sense of harmony. So he's perfectly integrated, he's perfectly whole, he's perfectly complete. He doesn't need anything to make himself anything. So this might sound a bit outlandish or not credible, but that's what the Buddha himself said, and that's what the tradition says. So I just want to introduce that idea just so we can sit with it for a little while. And of course, the Buddha offers a path to awakening, like I said. And he himself represents the end of the path. So the path is often talked about as a path of vision and transformation. So the Buddha himself represents the vision. So one way of understanding the path is by steeping ourselves more and more deeply in a vision of the Buddha. So in a way, that is a kind of path of transformation, in the same way that studying the works of an artist, soaking ourselves in their consciousness, will alter us, as that man said. Similarly, by just reflecting on the Buddha's life, by reflecting on him, on his person, we can transform our consciousness. And we can transform our consciousness according to the Buddhist tradition completely. Not just by visiting sacred spaces associated with the Buddha, but actually creating them. Because, for example, in Ireland, you can't visit a place where the Buddha was. So in a way, we need to create a space where we can have an encounter with the Buddha. And of course, we're going to have to do that through imagination. And in a way, that's what this place is. It's an attempt to create a sacred space. The shrine in particular is the focus for that space. It's a space where we can transform our consciousness through meditation, through communication, through studying Buddhist texts, through studying Buddhist rituals, and images, and performing rituals. And of course, we see the Buddha is as it were out there when we do that. The Buddha is external to us. In the same way that when we look at a piece of art, it's external to our own mind. And it's interesting that in Buddhist tantric meditation, what we begin to do is to see the Buddha in, as it were, our mind's eye. So it becomes less objectified. it becomes something that we see in our mind's eye. So we might see the Buddha himself, or we might see an archetypal image of his awakened quality. So there's an image like that on the wall over there of Green Tara, who embodies fearlessness and compassion, or fearless generosity and compassion. And then there's another image here of Padmasambhava, who embodies transformation. And so we see in our mind's eye, and we might hear the sound of his mantra, and his character, aspects of his character, are expressed in the image and the mantra. And we see the Buddha made of sound and light. So it's as if we're creating the image. So rather than just appreciate an external image, we begin to actually create it in ourselves. And actually, it can be more vivid than an external image. And then that light descends and suffuses our sense of ourselves. So our world is changed and our mind is changed through our encounter through our kind of, as it were, imaginative encounter with the Buddha. I'm just coming to the end now, shortly. So this is the process of vision and transformation. In a way, those kinds of meditation practices epitomize vision and transformation. We see something, and then that image, that vision, transforms us. We come into relationship with it. And it does not only transform us, in a way, it transforms the world in which we live. So according to some systems of Buddhist thought, all experience is created by mind. That's the inside, but also the outside. It's made of mind. So, for example, in the Dhammapada, I heard you mention the Dhammapada earlier, the first two verses say, experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. So what this means, it goes on to say, if one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. So what the Buddha seems to be saying here is that we are in an essentially creative relationship with the world around us. We're creating the experience that we have all the time. The question is, what's the quality of that creative activity? And the Buddha's referring to how if the mind is afflicted or impure, what will generate is suffering. And if it's pure, it will generate happiness for ourselves and others. So that's the key question, the quality of the way that we're acting. And this kind of transformation to a more and more creative state of mind through practicing the path of vision and transformation gets us to a point. In a way, this is the thought I want to leave you with, and then I'm going to read you a wee poem, that we can see every space as a transformative space. So we encounter that in a more potent or more rarefied kind of way in an actual space like this one, or in the Bacon studio, or in the place where the Buddha gained enlightenment, which is kind of the epitome of it. But through that, we can come to see the whole world as a sacred space where a reality is expressed everywhere. It's not restricted to this place or that place. So it's a much more dynamic relationship with the world in which we live in, where all spaces are expressive of something true and real. All spaces, all places are sacred or holy. So in the Vajrayana tradition, they talk about the Vajradhatu, or the realm of reality, which is like seeing the whole of experience as pervaded by reality. So that's where I'm going to leave you. But I just wanted to read you a little poem just that expresses this, I think, very aptly. I told my mother the title of this talk, and she said, "Oh, that sounds very intellectual." So I hope it hasn't been too intellectual. So I thought I'd evoke this kind of idea of everything being held in kind of a down-to-earth way. And I'm going to read a poem by Allen Ginsberg, and there is some obscenity in it. So I apologize if that offends your sensibility. It's not terribly obscene, but it's mildly obscene. And in a way, that's part of this point. Yeah. So this poem is called Footnote to Howl, which is a small section of that famous book that established his reputation that came out in the late 1950s. I'll just read this and I'll finish. Holy, 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 holy. The world is holy, the soul is holy, the skin is holy, the nose is holy, the tongue and cock and hand and asshole holy. Everything is holy. Everybody's holy. Everywhere is holy. Every day is an eternity. Every man's an angel. The bum's as holy as the seraphim. The man is holy as you, my soul, are holy. The typewriter is holy. The poem is holy. The voice is holy. The hair is holy. The ecstasy is holy. Holy Peter, Holy Alan, Holy Solomon, Holy Lucian, Holy Kerouac, Holy Hunky, Holy Burroughs, Holy Cassidy, holy the unknown buggered and suffering beggars, holy the hideous human angels, holy my mother in the insane asylum, holy the cocks of the grandfathers of Kansas, holy the groaning saxophone, holy the Bach apocalypse, holy the jazz bands, marijuana, hipsters, peace, peyote pipes and drums, holy the solitudes of skyscrapers and pavements, holy the cafeterias filled with the millions, holy the mysterious rivers of tears under the streets, holy the lone juggernaut, holy the vast lamb of the middle class, holy the crazy shepherds of rebellion, who digs Los Angeles, is Los Angeles, holy New York, holy San Francisco, holy Pereira and Seattle, holy Paris, holy Tangiers, holy Moscow, holy Istanbul, holy time and eternity and time, holy the clocks in space, holy the fourth dimension, holy the fifth international, holy the angel in Mark, holy the sea, holy the desert, holy the railroad, holy the locomotive, holy the visions, holy the hallucinations, holy the miracles, holy the eyeball, holy the abyss, holy forgiveness, mercy, charity, faith, holy, ours, bodies, suffering, magnanimity, holy the supernatural, extra brilliant, intelligent kindness of the soul.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.